Tamam, çok sağ olun.
Peki 6 dakika daha var hocam. 6 dakikamız daha var.
Hocam isterseniz başlayabiliriz isterseniz.
10
40
dakika
geçeydi
kalalım.
çünkü.
He?
40 geçeydi hocam, başlayabiliriz
50
isterseniz.
50. 50 geçe. Ben de baktım da 50 yazıyor. Öyle mi?
Ben de 40 geçe diye biliyordum ama şu an emin olamadım programa. Program yanımda değil.
Evet hocam, isterseniz 1-2 dakika açılışı ben yapayım. Bir iki İngilizce hazırladım sizin için. Metin hazırladım, onları biraz konuştuktan sonra sözü size bırakacağım.
Tamam.
We have a distinguished keynote speaker now, Professor Sibel Erduran from University of Oxford, United Kingdom. Her speech will be about future-oriented vision for science education and epistemic practices. I believe that everybody knows her. Everybody who is studying science education, especially in Turkey, know her very well. She is the president of the European Science Education Research Association, editor-in-chief, Science and Education, editor of International Journal of Science Education. On behalf of a conference committee, I would like to say welcome to our third Science, Math, Internship and Technology Education Conference. Thank you very much for coming and giving a speech to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Salih Hocam. It's a pleasure to be here. Merhaba, herkese merhaba diyorum. I haven't been to Turkey since the pandemic began, so this is a pleasure to be at least joining you from afar, and I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you again for your kind invitation, and it's nice to see you, Salih Hocam, online after having met in Poland about 10 years ago, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's nice to be in your company. I'm going to share my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we are seeing.
Yes? Okay. So my talk is going to be focused on epistemic practices of science. I'll explain what this means. And this is really about how do we futurize science education? How do we make science education more relevant and timely based on the needs of students currently and in the future, based on epistemic practices? So what I would like to do, first of all, is to start with the state of science education, the way we do science education versus what the future and current demands are on scientists and citizens, and the importance of equipping learners with skills to generate and evaluate scientific knowledge. And these are the epistemic practices. Epistemic practices are the knowledge practices of science. How do we generate knowledge? How do we evaluate knowledge? And in particular, I will be referring to argumentation, which is more about the what and the why of scientific knowledge. So how do we know in science? And also the diversity of methods that we use in science. So the how. So how do we generate knowledge through diversity of methods, and what knowledge we generate, and why do we generate, and how we generate and justify that knowledge. So after a brief theoretical background, I'll talk about two funded research projects that I have been leading. Both are 3-year projects. One is the Oxford Argumentation in Science and Religion project, and the second is Project Calibrate, which is about summative assessment of scientific methods. And in this project, we were investigating diversity of methods in science. And I will conclude with some key points and offer some implications. So if we take a profession like dentistry or many other professions, and we go back 100 years ago, we see that there were different practices. I mean, you can look at the picture at the bottom left, how dentists would perform tooth extractions. And today, so the practices of certain professions have changed significantly. Not only the practices, but the tools, the explanations for the phenomena in this practice of this profession. So a lot of advances would have happened in many professions based on research and experience and knowledge developed in those professions. When we look at science education, or education in general, actually, we can go back 100 years and then look at today. And sure, certain things have changed in science lessons. For example, the furniture might have changed. Not insignificantly, we might have girls in science education, in science lessons that we may not have had 100 years ago. But in terms of knowledge and scientific knowledge processes in the classroom, we have a lot of things that are still fairly traditional in nature. And we have not managed to incorporate much research into science education at the level of practice. So this is a problem. It's a problem because, well, we have this legacy in science education where we emphasize what we know rather than how we know or why we know something. We also emphasize recipe following rather than authentic scientific practices. So we tell students what they need to know. For example, photosynthesis is this, energy is this. In every topic in science education, you can find lots of factual information. And then we tell students to conduct certain investigations to confirm that knowledge for themselves. So essentially it's a recipe following without getting involved in open-ended inquiries in the way that scientists engage in inquiries. And a third problem in terms of the legacy for many years now is that there's a discrete separation of discrete subjects. So our curriculum in schools is organized around different subjects: chemistry, physics, science, Turkish, history, geography, discrete subjects, rather than other ways of, there might be different ways of organizing the curriculum across interdisciplinary boundaries. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because a lot of the problems that we're facing today are interdisciplinary, and a lot of information that is being generated through the media on the internet consists a lot of inaccurate information, and we're essentially in an age of misinformation. And there is a strong sentiment of anti-science attitudes currently. And we even have groups of people who challenge some basic wisdom of knowledge that we have gathered through science. For example, flat earthers. There's a whole group of people who challenge the view of the earth being a sphere. So it's really important for students to understand how knowledge is generated, how it's validated, and how it develops. And I mean, I hate to be reminding you that we're in the midst of a pandemic, because we haven't forgotten, actually. But in the context of the pandemic, we're currently experiencing science in the making. Not science that was done, but science in the making. It's happening right now. And the public is getting frustrated occasionally because they don't have the knowledge, because the knowledge is now being generated. And how is the knowledge being generated? Scientists are doing investigations on the virus. They're developing vaccines, and they're trying to justify, for example, which vaccine has higher efficacy and why. In doing so, they're employing a diversity of methods. So sometimes they might be collecting data about how the virus is affecting breathing over a period of time. Sometimes they might just test different vaccines between experimental groups and control groups. But the issue is that there is a range of methods that scientists are using, some of which include hypothesis testing, some of which don't have hypothesis testing. Some are just observations without any manipulation of variables. And I'll revisit this later, because in science education, we have tended to emphasize hypothesis testing and experimentation as key features of scientific inquiry, which is actually not, it is quite misplaced. And this is one of the things that we need to challenge, that there is a diversity of methods and not just a singular approach to doing science. So it's become really important for the general public and not just the scientists to understand how science works and how knowledge works in science. That scientific knowledge can also change depending on the evidence that's been collected. Now, what are we doing in science lessons? Well, there was a report recently published by Oxford University Press by some of our colleagues here. And they've asked about 400 teachers in 22 countries and regions to respond to a survey about a whole range of issues about science teaching and learning. And only 31% of the teachers who were surveyed believe that science education in their country is fit for the future. I mean, that it's actually equipping learners with the skills and knowledge that the learners will need in the future. I've had a chance to look at this survey, and one of the things I noticed is that many teachers emphasized climate change and environment as being the biggest challenges for the students in their future. They agree that this is, like, a great majority say this is the biggest challenge for the students. However, ironically, very few teachers considered issues like sustainability and trust in science as core purposes of science education. I mean, this is really interesting because while the teachers are recognizing the key aspects of what science education should do for the future, they're hesitant to include those aspects in their teaching. And this is a problem. Now, in a current project, in the Fedora project, which is funded by the European Union, we asked policymakers, so people who design the curriculum, who develop assessments nationally in 4 different countries, in England, Lithuania, Italy, and Finland. And we've produced a report recently. And in this report, one of the things that we've observed is that the majority of the policymakers emphasize interdisciplinarity as one of the key aspects of what we should be aiming for the future. Interdisciplinarity. And you can see some of the other themes that came out of that survey. So when we talk about interdisciplinarity, we don't just mean one aspect of this is science, technology, mathematics, entrepreneurship, engineering, the traditional STEM disciplines and related fields, but also more widely, what are some of the other subjects that we can be incorporating into science education? I came across a a news story about the pandemic response committee in Germany, in one of the states in Germany. All nations seem to have a pandemic expert group. And in one of these states, the experts included not just medical professionals and scientists, but also philosophers. I mean, philosophers, really? Philosophers, historians, theologians. They had representatives of different fields they still do, in their national state level response group to the pandemic. I was really curious about the role of the philosopher in this group. The philosophers were given the task of asking difficult questions. So everyone had a chance to respond. And this is the sort of interdisciplinary approach that a lot of complex problems will need in the world. We cannot solve even scientific problems with just science. I think this is what it counts to, and it's really interesting that a German state has recognized this, because we will need a range of stakeholders inputting into the debate. So again, epistemic practices. I want to focus on the how and the why and the what of scientific knowledge. So how is scientific knowledge produced? How is it justified? And these are cognitive processes underpinning all these processes, and discursive also. It's not just an individual cognitive activity, it's also a social activity to promote epistemic practices in science education. I'll pick up on the issue of interdisciplinarity in relation to one of the projects later on. So one of the epistemic processes that I have been engaged in for a number of years now, over 20 years now, is on argumentation. And argumentation, I know that a lot of people in Turkey are interested in argumentation at the moment. It's about coordinating knowledge in terms of justifying claims with evidence and reasons. And this is a skill that is required very broadly. I mean, you go to the supermarket and someone might try to sell you something, and you have to judge for yourself whether their claims are justified or not with evidence. So it's about justification of knowledge with evidence and reasons. Now, the how aspects is about the scientific method. Typically in school science, the scientific method has been taught as a linear step-by-step process, where you start with the purpose of an investigation, you produce a hypothesis, you design an experiment, you analyze the results of the experiment, and you reach some conclusions. So it's a linear step-by-step process, which is more like a recipe, like in the way that you might be making some food for dinner. You might follow a recipe without really understanding. I mean, it may work, right? You get the product at the end, but you don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, why you're adding this or why you're doing that. So this is usually referred to as the cookbook problem in science education. And this is a myth. I mean, scientific method doesn't really work like this. It's like a caricature of that scientific method. It's a myth. But in a way, it's a very dangerous myth, because it highlights, it emphasizes hypothesis testing and experiments as if these are the only way that scientists can do science. And then when you get students looking at certain subjects like biology, for example, biology may not have that many experiments. And the students might say, well, this isn't really scientific because you're just describing things. You're not really doing investigations. This isn't real proper science. Well, the thing is, in all subjects, scientists do hypothesis testing, experiments, but it depends on the research question, what you do. And in some cases, like in astronomy, you will not be doing experiments. I mean, it would be absurd to think about doing experiments on stars. Astronomy as a field is based a lot on observation. Can you hear me? Yeah, I was muted for some reason. I had a...
We can hear you, no problem.
Okay. So certain disciplines may rely more on certain aspects of doing science rather than others. So the dominance of this hypothesis testing and experiment in science lessons is really not justified. So we need to question how we're teaching students how science is done. So I'll present projects where we have interrogated these questions. Now, let me just give you a context in terms of your curriculum. I just looked at some of the curricula in Turkey, and sorry, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, so in the Turkish curricula, you have references to things like to argumentation, kanıta dayalı sonuçlar, or experiments and methodology, değişkenleri değiştirme, kontrol etme, deney yapma. These are the sort of things that are already in the curriculum. But how are we doing them at the level of the classroom? How are they being implemented in science lessons? So I want to share with you some of the work from funded projects that we have been doing, where we incorporated argumentation in science teaching and learning. And in terms of the practical work and the scientific method, we tried to bring together the thinking and the doing skills of science. And these projects have involved collaborations with teachers, students, as well as in one of the projects, some examiners. And we developed and tested some resources and strategies. So there are two projects. I'll start with the ORS project, which is the Oxford Argumentation in Religion and Science and Religious Education project. This project was funded by the Templeton World Foundation, and it involved a series of colleagues who were science educators, but also religious educators. So in England, religious education is part of the curriculum. There is no single national curriculum, but there are different local syllabi. And religious education is not about indoctrinating someone into a religion. It's more about the sociology of religions, or the social studies of religions, history of religions, different religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. Sociology of religion as well. And so in this project, we got together as science and religious education colleagues, and we tried to see how argumentation may work in science and religious education. Now, in terms of science education, I've done a lot of work for the past 20 years on argumentation. A lot of resources are out there, but I have to say the religious education component was a complete novelty for me. I was not sure where to situate argumentation in religious education. But the framework that we have used in science education was relevant for religious education as well. We've used Toulmin's framework of an argument, which includes these features on the right. I will give an example in a minute. But Toulmin allows for a different argument to be constructed from different disciplinary backgrounds, because in his framework, he talks about field-independent features of argumentation. So field-independent meaning any argument can have certain features, but then also aspects of a field, the theoretical suppositions of the field, like the backgrounds that would be very specific to a particular domain, like science or religious education or or history or sociology or law. So it's a scheme that can allow for argumentation to be examined from different domains, so that you can compare and contrast the different arguments in different domains. just to give you an example of Toulmin's framework, this can take a while to get your head around if you've never been introduced to it. But essentially, an argument consists of claims, data, warrants, backings, and rebuttals. That's the definition of an argument. And I've given an example from chemistry here. So if you make a claim like acids and bases react to produce neutral salts, what is the data that you can use to justify this claim? What warrants, the links or further justifications you can produce? And what theoretical statements you can say? And the conditions under which your main claim may not be true would be the rebuttal. Now, you can do the same with any religious education claim. I'll give some examples from their curricula in a minute, but this is roughly what we mean by argument. And in terms of epistemic practices, this is essentially about the construction of knowledge. The knowledge is the claim. We have a claim, and we're constructing the claim through reasoning with evidence and justifications. Now, in the case of religious education syllabi in England, again, there's a national science curriculum, but there's no national religious education curriculum, partly because even though the majority of the country in England is Christian, there are different religious groups in England. So each jurisdiction can have a difference in which religions get studied in that local context. But we've looked at different syllabi. And for example, in Leicestershire syllabus on religious education, we found 82 references to argumentation-related concepts. So texts say things like evaluate text sources of wisdom and authority and over evidence, give an account of God's existence using a rational argument, offer reasons as to why we do or do not need to prove God's existence. I mean, this is part of the curriculum, the syllabus in Leicestershire. In Oxfordshire, where I live, there are 16 references in the religious education syllabus on argumentation. And you see some examples. So for example, develop their evaluative skills, showing reasoned and balanced viewpoints when considering their own or others' responses. Explicit references like formulate reasoned opinions, arguments in relation to controversial issues and truth. Now, guess how many references to argumentation there is in the science curriculum at the same age group in the national curriculum? Nothing. Argumentation is not explicitly referred to in the science curriculum. Now, I find this really interesting because I would have expected the opposite. I would have expected science curriculum to be full of, narrative around reasoning and justification and claims and evidence, and maybe not the religious education syllabus, but we ended up seeing the opposite trend. And so what this says is that probably there are things to be learned across different interdisciplinary investigations about how syllabi cover argumentation or knowledge construction. And we worked with teachers. I'll explain how we work with the teachers, but at the beginning of our work with the teachers, we asked the science teachers and the religious education teachers, about 30 altogether, to tell us about how often they use strategies that support argumentation. Strategies like group work, debates, writing frames, checking students' evidence, anticipating counter arguments. We had a whole list of pedagogical strategies that teachers reported to be using themselves. So it's self-reported strategies. And we saw that the religious education teachers had a significantly more number of occurrences in their teaching, the self-reported teaching, in relation to group discussions and debates. So religious education teachers are reporting to be using these strategies more often. Well, this isn't exactly surprising because their curriculum is including this more often. I mean, they're more attuned to doing these kinds of strategies in their lessons. But this is something that we've learned. I did not know this before this project, that the religious education teachers were using argumentation to such an extent. We brought the teachers together, which is very rare. I mean, science and religious education teachers don't talk to each other in England, very rarely. They have no reason to talk to each other. In fact, they are usually framed in opposition to each other. But as part of our project, we brought them together and we wanted to capitalize on their expertise. So the religious education teachers, quite a lot of them have PhDs in philosophy or history of theology. I mean, they're very well equipped with argumentation theory, and ways of knowing ideas are very common in their vocabulary. So we thought the science teachers could learn from some of the experiences of the religious education teachers. And but then we needed to sort of ensure that there are some common ways of working together and building common goals. So we did a professional development work with them. So here we have a structure of their continuous professional development, CPD program. This was before we started the project, before the pandemic set in. So we were bringing the teachers together into the university, and they would be working together, sharing resources, and they would go back to their schools, work together in their schools, come back. And there was this iterative process of working together, sharing resources, sometimes teaching together, and observing each other as well. So we've had a professional development agenda like this, and this fits within this interdisciplinary agenda where we fostered collaboration between the science and religious education teachers, focusing on argumentation. I have to say, often science and religion are presented in opposition to each other. And this was one area where they could be constructively working together without appealing to any conflict. I mean, because argumentation is something that is relevant to both subjects, as the curriculum has illustrated, in terms of religious education, at least. So science education, I mean, science teachers were beginning to learn more about the nature of argumentation in relation to their subject. We've looked at the teachers' views of argumentation as well. I mean, how do they compare? Teachers and science and religious education teachers. There were similarities and differences. The similarities, they both see argumentation as a way of justifying claims. They agree. They emphasize that it's important to draw from a range of sources to support claims. They both groups identified the skill of argumentation as an important and general skill. There were differences, however, as well. Expectedly. I mean, I would expect this. So in science, the science teachers were very concerned about you can argue, but you always need to come to the right conclusion. So the right and the wrong idea, the information, the facts were very important for the science teachers. Whereas for the religious education teachers, it wasn't that important. For them, it was more like whether you can distinguish a better or a worse argument. It was more of a relativist account of relative evaluative account of knowledge claims, not discrete right or wrong sort of accounts. And I think this is really important to recognize that in different disciplines, ways of knowing and ways of justifying knowledge claims may be different. I mean, that's just how it is. There are different norms and ways of knowing in different disciplines. In terms of the students, I don't have time to go through this was a 3-year project that recently was concluded, so I don't have time to go through all the different aspects of it, but we got the students to discuss some big questions that often come up. So creation versus intelligent design, kind of creationism versus evolution arguments. And we've literally put this on the table for them to discuss and to evaluate 4 different claims using a set of evidence cards that would support either each claim. So they would be able to put those claims against the different, the cards which included information against those claims. I mean, the details of this analysis is very interesting. It's in review in a journal at the moment, and but it gave us an indication of how the students reason about these big questions about science and religion. We've done other investigations with students that have already been published. For example, we have designed tasks in the context of religious education, science, and then a combined, and using similar argument structures so that we can compare the students' reasoning across these 3 different approaches. And in this case, we found that the students were really challenged about reasoning in the religious education context, surprisingly. And it could be because the science teachers actually had a more uptake in the project because they started up with less background in argumentation. So it could be that the science teachers' students ended up having more gains. But so if you're interested in seeing these tasks and how we've analyzed the different arguments, I've included the paper's reference here. So we've also asked the teachers to talk about, to evaluate the project, and overwhelmingly they had a positive impression and that it engaged them in a positive and constructive way. We asked the students in particular to tell us about interdisciplinary learning. I mean, because they were taught in science and religious education, and we made argumentation as a bridge between the 2 subjects, as a way to promote cross-curricular and cross-subject teaching. And they had also overwhelming majority were pleased with being aware of arguments from different sources and interdisciplinary approaches in teaching. So these were all very encouraging for us. So far I've talked about the ORS project and argumentation, which is about epistemic practices of knowledge construction, justification of knowledge claims with reasons and evidence. And I've shown you some examples of how we work with the teachers, what the teachers thought and what the students thought. And now I want to move on to epistemic practices in terms of the how scientific knowledge is developed, the methods of science, in the context of Project Calibrate. This project was co-funded by the Wellcome Trust, Royal Society, and the Gatsby Foundation in England. And it included not just us in science education, but educational assessment colleagues at Oxford, but also colleagues at AQA, which is an examination board. In England, there are national examination boards that produce examinations and textbooks, and schools sign up to follow these textbooks, and then they take the students take examinations offered by those exam boards. So AQA is the biggest examination board, and the examinations determine where you go to university, basically, with the exams that you take. So we collaborated with AQA to develop some assessments, summative assessments, high stakes assessments, to incorporate diversity of scientific methods in practical science. You'll remember this slide from earlier when I said we wanted to challenge this linear model of the scientific method, but we challenge it and then what? What else do we do instead, right? So what else we did instead is that we used a framework called Brandon's Matrix. So Brandon's Matrix, I know this figure is very cluttered and it has a lot of features in it, but bear with me. So it's a matrix. It's a 2x2 matrix based on 2 questions. Are we testing a hypothesis, or are we making observations or measuring parameters? And the second question is, are we changing variables or not? So you have this table with 4 categories, Brandon's matrix. And here we have examples of each on the right-hand side. So sometimes scientists test hypotheses and they change variables, but sometimes they test hypotheses and they don't change variables. Sometimes they don't test hypotheses at all. I mean, they just describe or measure phenomena by changing variables. And sometimes they describe and measure phenomena and they don't change variables. And all of these are proper, credible methods in science. But for some reason, we tend to emphasize science being hypothesis testing and changing variables, the first cell. And this is what we are challenging, that we want to diversify students' understanding of scientific methods. But when we looked at examination questions in this project, so I mentioned that AQA is an examination board. So we looked at exam papers from 3 examination boards. So exam board A, B, C, and they have different papers. The papers are the exams that students sit nationally. And I know that this is a lot of things to take in, but we don't need to understand the full details, just to show you that if those 4 categories, 4 colors are about each cell of Brandon's matrix, you can see that there is uneven representation. Okay, so yellow is the most occurring example in chemistry examination questions, which is the non-manipulative parameter measurement category. So and in some cases, for example, paper 1 in exam board A, you have 2 of the categories missing. They don't ask questions to that effect. Now you might say, so what? I mean, the exam questions are like this. Well, we know that teachers teach to the exam. So if the examination questions don't have certain aspects of the scientific method, they're not going to be teaching to them, because the exams drive what teachers do in the classroom. So this was a baseline understanding for us about how exam questions incorporate different aspects of Brandon's matrix categories of scientific methods. And we then ended up designing our own in collaboration with examiners at AQA. We worked with the examiners and we designed sort of balanced assessment questions, summative assessment questions in different topics for those 4 different categories of Brandon's matrix, and also a 5th category where they could compare and contrast the different methods as well. Sort of a higher level question of evaluating the different methods. And here's the website to these. These are available to download freely, and you can have a look at them. So here's one I just wanted to visually show you. So we worked with the examiners and tested the validity of these exam questions. And so we have examples, and they're all sort of, they include marks, and they include these different approaches to the scientific method. We've also in this project developed some video-based resources, which are also available on our website, in physics, biology, and chemistry topics, to give an example. They're not the only examples. Teachers can do these in different ways, to incorporate Brandon's matrix idea and diversity of methods in different science topics. And we've asked the teachers what they thought about Brandon's matrix. And for the most part, they were very positive. For example, one teacher said that it made children think about what they were doing. So it had that function to get students to think about what they were doing in their practical work. But they emphasize that this shouldn't be taught separately, but as something that is incorporated into their teaching. Now, after developing all these resources, we did a study where we collected data from 969 students and 152 teachers who use these resources and assessments. And we wanted to see if they had any impact on the students' understanding of scientific methods. And it was encouraging to see that the resources helped the students understand scientific methods. There was a significant difference in their scores. We tested their understanding of scientific methods before and after the implementation of these videos. So that was quite encouraging for us. We also asked the students to tell us about the approaches in this project. And I want to highlight a quote that I quite like in this from the students, who said, "Before I watched the videos, I thought all scientific investigations require a hypothesis of some sort, which these videos disproved in an easy to understand way. Thank you for opening my eyes." So if you look at their evaluation of the different videos, clearly most of them didn't enjoy watching the videos. And I have to say, this was at the onset of the pandemic, so it could be that they were overloaded with lots of videos. But the fact that they said that the majority of them said these were about practical science was really important for us, because these are videos of practical work. They're not actually doing them. So they could identify the videos as practical work. And Brandon's matrix it's about thinking about practical work. It's not the actual doing. It's the doing and the thinking. So it was important for us to see if the students could recognize that these were practical science problems. And so this was encouraging. This is the same. I mean, there are different specific aspects to what they were saying, but the overall approach was received well by the students. And they also thought that the questions were similar to what they normally do, which they're not actually. But the fact that they think that they are similar in a way puts a bit of a authenticity to these being high stakes assessment questions from the point of view of the students. So in conclusion, what I've tried to do in this presentation is to argue that we need to be promoting epistemic practices of science in order to equip learners about why we know and how we know, and as well as what we know in science. And I've shown some strategies that we've used with teachers to develop the teacher's skills in doing so. I've shown some examples of how the interdisciplinary elements of ways of knowing might come into play in science lessons. And we've sort of gone beyond this myth of the traditional scientific method to be a singular approach to diversifying different methods of science. And then therefore to include issues about how knowledge is generated. And I mean, ultimately, this is about equipping the learners about thinking and doing science that are authentic and that they're needed for complex problem solving in the future. And there's a project that we've started recently, which is the European Union funded Fedora project, where I think the ideas that I've been talking about get consolidated through a bold vision. I think we need a bold vision. We need to be courageous. We're not brave enough in science education. We say lots of things, and then we just like hold back when we don't do enough, or we're just too timid. And we need a bold vision and a proactive agenda to do the things that we're talking about, and to reshape how we see scientific knowledge in the classroom, how scientific knowledge is done, how it works at the level of the classroom, so that students can experience not just the outcomes of science, but the processes of knowledge generation and production in science. And I think for this, we need new territories of research, new areas of research. And I think here we'll have more and more emphasis on cross-subject teaching, because we can learn a lot from different subjects in the way that we've learned in religious education teachers' practices about how things are done. And we need to foster collaboration between teachers of different subjects so that they can learn from each other. And so this is only one aspect of a systemic approach. And I think we need to engage different stakeholders, and we need to sort of engage not just with teachers and students, but also in the way that we're doing the Fedora project, policymakers. I mean, education is an ecosystem, and we need to, unless we do a coordinated approach in the way that in Project Calibrate we included examiners and examination policymakers, we need to be engaged with a range of stakeholders who have a stake in these matters. And that's the sort of vision that I think will help us restructure science education in a way that will equip learners with not things from 100 years ago, but current and future-looking agendas for education. So here's the website for the ORS project, or our publications and approaches resources are available, including videos of teachers, science and religious education teachers teaching. There are examples on our website if you wanted to look at those. And here's the website for Project Calibrate. Again, we have all our resources on there, or they're all free to download. And thank you very much for listening. Teşekkür ederim.
Dear Professor Sibel Erduran, thank you very much for your nice and valuable speech. I believe you spent too much time to prepare this presentation, because it is really very, very good, and I believe all the people follow you understood many things from your speech.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that.
You are welcome. I would like to ask one question, then I will give the audience, and they will ask some question to you. In Turkey, you know, maybe religious or value education is different than science education curriculum.
Yes.
National Minister of Education, approximately 5 years ago, they prepared 2023 education vision document. In this document, they try to, theoretically, they try to integrate lessons curriculum, science curriculum or math curriculum with value education and value curriculum. What do you think about this document? Have you been read it? Get any chance to read this document?
Yeah.
It is theoretically seems very good, but in Turkey we know that many scientists, they don't interest in value or religious education. Many religious scientists who are studying in religious education, also they don't know many things about science.
Yes.
What should be our starting point in this case? What type of argumentation we can do to integrate or link these two disciplines together, and then this big purpose can be achieved? Thank you.
Okay, so the easy part to that question is I have not read this document. I would be very interested in looking at it. So I cannot comment on the document itself because I haven't seen it. However, I mean, just in a fairly general sense, I think one of the things that we need to learn is to want to learn from each other. I mean, it doesn't help to be constructing conflicts all the time. And it also doesn't help to push people to believe in a certain thing or another. Any sort of dogma is not good, whether it's scientific dogma or religious dogma. So I think we cannot tell people what to believe or not to believe, first of all, because people have worldviews, and I think that we should sort of feel comfortable about that. Now, that doesn't mean that we conflate different ways of knowing. I mean, science has a certain way of knowing, and we can appreciate that. Religious worldviews have certain ways of knowing, and we can appreciate that as well. I mean, we need to go beyond these fairly unproductive conversations where we build on controversy. We need to find ways of feeling comfortable with different ways of knowing, first of all, without compromising. I mean, I'm not suggesting. So one of the things that I've shown you in my data, in our data, is how science teachers insist on correct versus incorrect accuracy. It's very important for them to say, this is the right answer, this is the right conception. Whereas the religious education teachers are like, well, you know, sometimes it might be a better argument, this is worse, and it's that they're not that bothered about the right or wrong answer. But that's how it is in that domain. And so it's important to recognize these differences and learn to let people be also. I don't find it, you know, we can debate and discuss different worldviews, but the worldviews are worldviews.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Thank you very much. Now, there is, I believe, one guy he wants to ask a question to you.
sure.
Yeah.
Bu arada Türkçe'de soru sorabilirsiniz. Türkçe soru sormak
Evet, Türkçe'de
varsa.
soru sorabilir. Thank you very much to open this door to
Konuşma
us.
bunu I think there might be someone international here. I saw a name earlier.
There is Antony. She is a well-known scientist in Indonesia.
Okay.
He sometimes participate in our congress and our discussion.
So
Evet
I can
arkadaşlar, Türkçe'de
translate as
sorabiliriz
well.
sorularımızı.
Yeah, okay. Türkçe sorabilirsiniz. Türkçe cevaplamaya çalışacağım.
Evet, Suat Hocam buyurun.
Hocam teşekkür ederim bu güzel sunumunuz için Sibel Hocam. Ayrıca Salih Hocam size de teşekkür ederim bu güzel kongreyi düzenlediğiniz için. Aslında sorumu İngilizce sormayı planlıyordum ama Türkçe herhalde
İngilizce
daha
de
güzel.
sorabilirsiniz tabii.
Evet, daha güzel sorarım hocam.
Tamam.
Biliyorsunuz son zamanlarda işte bu pandemi koşullarında bilimsel okuryazarlık daha da sanki ön plana çıktı gibi. Bilimsel okuryazar bireylerin önemi. İşte aşı karşıtlıkları var. İşte bütün dünyada ülkeler, yöneticiler, liderler insanları aşı olmaya ikna etmeye çalışıyor. Benim 2 tane sorum var. Birincisi bu sunumunuzun 1. bölümü için, diğeri de 2. bölümü için. Sizce bu aşı karşıtlığı bilimin doğası anlayışlarındaki yetersizliklerin ya da bilimin doğası ile ilgili bilimin doğasının hangi boyutuyla ilgili yetersizliklerden kaynaklanıyor? Epistemik ve bilişsel boyutuyla mı yoksa sosyal ve kurumsal boyutuyla mı? Birinci sorum bu.
Hı hı.
İkinci sorum da hocam, projeniz hakikaten çok ilginç, çok dikkat çekici ve seçkin gerçekten. Başka bir pencereden bakmışsınız bizim çalıştığımız konulara, bilimin doğasına vesaire. Sorum şu, bu proje acaba din bilim çatışmasına uzatılan bir zeytin dalı mı? Yoksa bu proje bu tartışmayı daha da alevlendirir mi? İkinci sorum da bu hocam. Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederim Suat Hocam. Gerçekten güzel sorular.
Çok güzel
İkisi de
sorular.
doktora çalışması olur hocam. İki doktora tezi doğdu.
Estağfurullah hocam.
Gerçekten yani yaptığım sunumun özüne giden, kalbine giden sorular bunlar. Şimdi ilk soru işte bu sunumumu bu yüzden İngilizce yaptım. Vaccine hesitancy.
İngilizce konuşabilirsin hocam. Buradaki arkadaşlar
Vaccine
İngilizce biliyor
hesitancy.
hocam.
Vaccine Türkçesi nasıl söylemiştim?
Aşı hocam, aşı.
Aşı, ha.
Evet.
Aşı karşıtı.
Aşı karşıtlığı hocam çok popüler.
Karşıtlığı. Evet, İngilizce'de vaccine hesitancy diye geçiyor da. Şimdi bu bilimin doğasının hangi boyutuyla alakalı?
Evet.
Soruydu.
Ya da bilimin hangi boyutuyla hocam? Evet.
Bilişsel mi, epistemik mi, sosyal mi?
Kurumsal mı?
Kurumsal mı? Bence yani tabii bu empirik bir soru. Bunu bu gibi insanlar üzerinde test edebiliriz ve
Evet,
oradan
güzel bir proje
çıkarabiliriz. Büyük bir ihtimalle hepsinin bileşim, yani benim tahminim birçok şeyi zaten bütünsel bir şekilde öğretmediğimiz için bilimin doğasını büyük bir ihtimalle birçok eksikliklerden dolayı bu ortaya çıkıyor. Yani bilgi nasıl üretilir, nasıl gelişir?
Sanki bununla daha çok ilgili değil mi hocam? Bilime güven yok. Bilim insanının nasıl çalıştığına yönelik bilgi yok.
Yok. Ama işte bize burada çok bunu çözmek için de insanlara işte sen bilimi bilmiyorsun, anlamıyorsun falan bu tipi tarz yaklaşımlar da yapıcı değil. Onu da yapıcı bulmuyorum. Çünkü insanlara yani tam tersini yapacak bu sefer. Yani
Hocam özür dilerim, bir ekleme yapabilir miyim? İşte
evet.
tam bu noktada aslında sizin projenizi dayandırdığınız varsayım var ya hocam, ya da teorik framework mu diyelim. Baştan ben onu yakaladım. Dediniz ki karşılaştığımız problemlerin birçoğunu belki sadece bilimi kullanarak çözemiyoruz.
Aynen.
Yani
Çünkü
burada
konu bilimsel değil.
evet.
Yani insanların aşı olup olmak istememesinin altında sadece bilimsel bilgi yatmıyor. Ya bu sigara içmekle falan gibi böyle yani çok daha basit örneklerde de bu var. Bilimsel olarak sigara içmenin size zararlı olabileceğini biliyorsunuz ama yine de içiyorsunuz mesela. Yani orada tabii başka şeyler de var, müptela olmak var falan ama yani bilimsel bilgi sadece yeterli olmuyor birçok konuda. Daha o yüzden interdisciplinary bir approach yaptığımız zaman ya farklı açılardan bir araya getirebilmemiz lazım bu konuları.
Hocam işte bu düşünceniz bilimde şu anda sahip olduğumuz paradigmayı böyle yıkmaya yönelik bir şey.
Şimdi ama bu şeyden farklı bir şey. Yani bilimi yıkmaktan bahsetmiyoruz ama.
Hayır yok
Yani,
onu demiyorum. Paradigmayı, bakış açılarımız hocam.
bakış açısı, evet. Bakış açısı yani şöyle bilim insanlarının toplum içerisinde ve değişik insan topluluklarının düşünce şekillerini topluma yansıtacak şekilde bir şekilde onlarla diyalog halinde olması gerektiğini gösteriyor bu. Yani işte bu Almanya'dan verdiğim örnekte tarihçiler, felsefeciler, bilim insanları hepsi bir araya gelmiş. Alman hükümeti bu insanlar bir araya getirmiş, bir komite kurmuş, pandemiyle uğraşıyorlar hep birlikte. Çok ilginç bir yaklaşım. Çünkü problem kompleks zaten. İnsan psikolojisi mesela. Bu da bunun bir parçası. Yani psikolojiden ne anlıyoruz? İnsanlar hastalığı nasıl algılıyor? Mesela bu da insanlardan bahsediyoruz çünkü.
İnançları değil mi hocam?
İnançları ayrıca yani bunları örtbas edip de şimdi her şey işte bunu ben çok tehlikeli görüyorum şey açısından. Ben fen eğitimcisiyim ancak fen eğitimi eğer bilimi herkese dogmatik bir şekilde baskıyla uygulayacaksa bu da doğru değil. Yani bu insanlara bilimi anlayabilmeleri için yol göstermemiz lazım.
Evet.
Tabii ki dünya düzdür, işte flat earth'tür dediğinde tabii ki ben onu tasdik edecek değilim. Ama orada değildir deyip de geçmekle de olmuyor işte. Onu söylemeye çalışıyorum. Yani
Hocam isterseniz Nermin hocamın sorusunu alalım.
tabii.
Çünkü çok sayıda soru gelecek şimdi hocam. Zamanımız da az. Nermin
Tamam.
hocam buyurun.
Teşekkür ederim Salih hocam. I would like to ask my question in English,
Sure.
if possible. Thank you so much for your nice and very informative presentation, Dr. Erdoğan. I have actually two questions. I really would like to know, after you close the first project that you just presented about, how pedagogical strategies can be taught to science teachers. You know, you had a very nice combination, very nice relations between science teachers and religious educators. So I think that was a 3-year project, and you said you just finalized the project.
Yes.
I wonder how you report the findings of the project to your Minister of Education, just like Milli Eğitim in Turkey. So how do you plan to adapt the findings of this project for your middle school educators, for your education faculties or so? That's the first question. The second question is, in your very last slide of your presentation, you talked about the cross-subject teaching, which is, I think, directly related to interdisciplinary approach, which you really suggested throughout your presentation. So in Turkey, we really encourage to write interdisciplinary project in universities, just like Bursa Uludağ University. We are always encouraged to write this type of projects for your academic performances. So how do you suggest, what might be your suggestion for us, for Turkey researchers in Turkey? How could we increase the number of interdisciplinary projects just to support your idea in your very last slide of your presentation? Thank you so much.
These are also very good questions. I mean, we need a whole session on questions. I mean, I'm really enjoying the questions, by the way. So the impact of the ORS project. So, I mean, this was a privately funded project. So the foundation that funded it is not a government agency. So, but what we are planning on doing and are doing is engaging with different stakeholders like OECD. Like whenever we have an opportunity to feed into any sort of consultation process, we're doing so. And we're continuing to disseminate the work.
Okay.
So that's, I mean, as long as we keep on trying, in England, it's the system is slightly different in terms of the education stakeholders and how you can impact different stakeholders. But we are aware of this and are engaging with our project outputs with different stakeholders. I mean, for example, I'm doing a workshop with more teachers and, things like that as well. The second question about interdisciplinary collaboration, I think interdisciplinary collaboration is not easy, first of all. I mean, let me just say that. Because we have been in separate camps.
Yeah.
It's a bit like, forgive my use of a food analogy. I have a food science, food chemistry background. So you have oil and water, and you want to make mayonnaise. I mean, you have to shake them up really strongly. I mean, they're not going to mix. So it's learning across disciplinary boundaries is not easy. You have to understand a new language. People from other disciplines are situated in different community practices. Their priorities are different. So it takes a while to form a common language so that you can even begin to understand what the other people are talking about. So first of all, I would explicitly acknowledge this. I mean, it might help to put this on the table, to be aware, to be explicitly aware that we're coming to this from different perspectives. But the problem that you're investigating needs to be something of interest to all the different people.
Yeah.
Because if it's just something that is interesting to one or relevant to one group of people, it's not going to work. The others will drop out. So it's, again, being patient and listening to different perspectives and making sure that everybody's agendas are taken into consideration together.
Yes.
It's about
Thank you
community.
very much again. Time is over a little bit.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
One
I
question,
appreciate it.
Oya Ağlarca. Another question.
Merhaba hocam.
Merhaba Oya.
Merhaba. Sizi gördüğüme çok memnun oldum. Kongreyi düzenlediğiniz için teşekkür ederim Salih hocam ve diğer hocalarım. Sibel hocam, benim aslında Suat hocamın sorusuyla paralel bir sorum olacaktı. Bazı durumlarda vaccine hesitancy veya bilim karşıtlığı görüşleri bilim insanlarının kendisi de üretebiliyor. Mesela burada bir örnek paylaştım. Michael Yeadon isimli bir BioNTech herhalde bir yönetici aşı yapılmaması gerektiğini savunuyor. Türkiye'de böyle örnekler var. Tanınmış bilim insanları aşı yapılmaması gerektiği, faz çalışmalarının tamamlanmadığı gibi görüşler sunuyor. Tabii benim burada sorum, öğrencilere mutlaka aşı yaptırın, kesinlikle yapın gibi böyle bir ultimatom yapmamız değil. Ama bu tarz bilime ilişkin şüpheli görüşleri nasıl doğru şekilde yönlendirebiliriz? Öğrenci böyle bir örnekle çıktığında işte şu bilim insanı aşı yaptırmayın diyor. İşte bunun yerine başka alternatif tedaviler uygulayın diyor. Deyince biz onlara nasıl örnekler sunmalıyız? Teşekkürler.
Evet. Şimdi öncelikle bilim dediğimiz şey bir kişinin fikrine dayalı bir şey değil.
Evet, doğru. Tabii
Yani
ki.
bir kişi bir şey dedi diye belli bilgiler kabul edilmiyor veya reddedilmiyor. İki taraflı da reddedilmesi veya kabul edilmesi bir kişinin fikrine bağlı değil. Yani bilimin en önemli özelliklerinden birisi bu scientific ethos dediğimiz şey. Bilim insanlarının bilgiyi sürekli bir süzgeçten geçirmesi durumu. Ve bu süzgeçten geçirme sürecinde bazı fikirler, yani bilim insanları arasında da hemfikir olmayan konular olabiliyor, yani bu olabilir. Yani daha doğrusu bilim zaten böyle çalışıyor. Argumentation'dan bahsettim. Yani argumentation 2, 3, 4 fikir bir arada belli bir, yani bilimin belli bir döneminde farklı fikirler, alternatif teoriler, modeller olabiliyor. Yani öncelikle bunu söylemek lazım bence. Yani bilimde tek fikir yok ki zaten. Yani belli bir süreç içinde olmayabiliyor. Belli bir süreç sonrasında o süzecinden geçtiği zaman bazı fikirler bir sonuca varıyor. Yani şu anda aşılarla ilgili belli bir konsensus var bir yere kadar. Bu kadardır. Yani şu an bu kadardır. Yani ya onu yapacaksın, ya aşı olacaksın, ya da alternatif olarak hasta olacaksın. Yani bu kadardır. Şimdi aşı olmak istemiyorsa artık o da onun, yani yapacak bir şey yok bir anlamda.
Hocam çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Teşekkürler.
Şimdi arkadaşlardan sesini, herkesin mikrofonunu açmasını istiyorum. Hocamı güzel bir alkışlayalım. Hem de hocama katılıp belgesini verelim. Gerçekten çok değerli zamanını bizim için ayırdı. Yani bilimin ne olduğunu ve güzel efendim bize anlatmaya çalıştı. Katılım belgesi var mı? Çıkmadı mı hocam? Katılım belgesini görelim hocamın, ondan sonra da alkışlayalım. Hocam, gelecek kongremizde sizi Bursa'da bekliyoruz, ağırlayacağız.
Çok teşekkür ederim.
Bizim araştırmacılarımızın içinde saatlerce durmanız gerekiyor hocam. Evet, alkışlıyoruz hocamızı.
Çok teşekkür ederim.
Emeğinize sağlık hocam. Çok teşekkür
Tekrardan
ediyorum.
çok davetiniz
Saygılarımızı
için.
sunuyoruz. İnşallah Türkiye'de yüz yüze görüşeceğiz diyorum.
İnşallah.
Bütün katılımcılar adına çok çok teşekkür ediyorum. Saygılarımı sunuyoruz hocam.
Çok sağ olun.